Great. The Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Welcome to the first subcommittee hearing of the new Congress, and welcome to our returning members and our new members on both sides of the aisle. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. We have a quorum. I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. And pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Our hearing this morning will examine the devastating humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Our subcommittee's decision to make this the topic of our first hearing of this Congress demonstrates the desperate urgency with which the United States should confront the humanitarian situation in Yemen. I note that this hearing is part one of two. Part two will focus on the political situation in Yemen. The UN has declared the situation in Yemen to be the world's worst humanitarian crisis. According to the UN, 2/3 of Yemenis need humanitarian assistance just to survive. More than 16 million people will face hunger this year, and nearly 50,000 Yemenis are already starving to death. Nearly half of Yemen's children under age 5 will suffer from acute malnutrition this year, including 400,000 who could die without urgent treatment. 400,000 children under the age of 5. Consider that malnutrition in young children perpetuates health and developmental problems into adulthood, and one recognizes that the world cannot afford to ignore this problem. And yet, the global community's response to this crisis is to date inadequate. And this is evident not only by the continued belligerence of the warring parties in Yemen, but also by the fact that pledges at the UN's recent high-level pledging event for Yemen fell far short of what is needed, marking the second year in a row that the UN humanitarian appeal has not been met. In that vein, I want to applaud the State Department's announcement of $191 million in additional humanitarian aid on March 1st, in addition to recognizing pledges by Saudi Arabia, Germany, the UAE, the UK, and others. These pledges are a good start, but they are insufficient to stem the humanitarian challenges in Yemen. Additional pledges should be made, and I particularly urge the governments of the Saudi-led coalition to bear a greater share of this cost. U.S. leadership is necessary to resolve the crisis in Yemen. President Biden has been clear that America will stake a responsible, engaged, and stabilizing international role. It is imperative that the United States set a high bar in meeting the extreme need in Yemen with a bold humanitarian assistance package. The humanitarian, security, and political dimensions of the crisis in Yemen are closely linked. Truly resolving the humanitarian crisis will require the warring parties to reach a negotiated political solution. And to that end, I support the Biden administration's early attention to Yemen, including the naming of Special Envoy Tim Lenderking, lifting the blanket FTO designation on the Houthis to prevent assistance delays so that we can address the humanitarian crisis, using targeted sanctions, ending support for offensive operations, supporting Saudi's legitimate self-defense needs, and, according to media reports, meeting with Houthi leadership. Any assessment of Yemen's challenges must address the crippling pain and suffering that the Saudi-led coalition and Houthi forces have inflicted and are still inflicting on the Yemeni people. Although, after sustained pressure from Congress, coalition airstrikes have killed fewer civilians recently than earlier in the conflict. Coalition restrictions on commercial and humanitarian shipments in and out of Yemen continue to wreak havoc on Yemen's economy, driving up the price of food in a malnourished country. recent restrictions on fuel deliveries have led to innumerable consequences for average Yemenis who depend on fuel to reach market, pump clean water, and meet essential needs. It is completely unacceptable that this is still happening. I also strongly condemn the Houthi actions both in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. They bear grave responsibility for obstructing essential humanitarian assistance and trampling on basic human rights. At this moment, the Houthi offensive in Marib threatens to displace hundreds of thousands more Yemenis and is pouring more fuel on this conflict that has already burned too long. If the Houthis want to be part of the political process, they must immediately commit to a ceasefire and engage in negotiations under UN auspices. All of this has presented incredible challenges for humanitarian access. I hope that the witnesses can unpack some of that for us today, helping us better understand the humanitarian crisis itself and how it relates to political and security environment. I thank the witnesses for joining us. I look forward to their testimony. And I now yield to my friend from South Carolina, our ranking member, Joe Wilson, for any opening comments that he may have. Mr. Wilson, it's terrific to serve with you again, and you are recognized for 5 minutes of opening remarks. Aviva, I thought I saw the ranking member. Do we have the ranking member?
We do not have the ranking member yet, so if you could introduce the witnesses.
I will go ahead and introduce the witnesses, and with their indulgence, should the ranking member arrive, we'll turn to him before turning to the witnesses for their testimony. But let me introduce our distinguished witnesses, two of whom are joining us live today from Yemen. First, Ms. Radhya Almutawakel is a leading Yemeni human rights defender, chairperson and co-founder of the Mwatana Organization for Human Rights, an NGO that advocates for human rights and supports victims of human rights violations. She has presented and given testimony at numerous international events and forums, including the European Parliament, the UN Security Council, and the US Congress, including our subcommittee. We are pleased to welcome her back to testify again today. And I want to note that Radhya first testified in this committee almost exactly 2 years ago. We invited her back today to illustrate just how dire the situation in Yemen has become in these past 2 years. Next is Mr. Abdulwasea Mohammed. He is the National Policy Advisor for Oxfam in Yemen. Prior to joining Oxfam, he worked at several NGOs, internationally funded programs on humanitarian action and development at various provinces in Yemen, including Handicap International and GIZ, both in Sana'a and in Socotra Island. His work experience, humanitarian action, has included a variety of projects across sustainable development, livelihoods, gender, and community and institutional development. We're glad to have Mr. Mohammed with us. And finally, Ms. Amanda Catanzano is the Senior Director for International Programs Policy and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee, where she focuses on raising the profile of global humanitarian needs, protecting humanitarian access in conflict settings, and promoting fidelity to international humanitarian law and demanding accountability for those who violate it. Prior to IRC, Ms. Catanzano held roles in the government, including National Security Council and Department of State, as well as in the private sector, including at Booz Allen. I thank all of the witnesses for being here today. And let's see if the ranking member is the ranking member's camera is on. Before we turn it to the witnesses, Mr. Wilson, are you available? Seeing that he is not, I will proceed to our witnesses and thank again all of the witnesses for being with us today. And Ms. Almutawakel, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Sorry. I couldn't.
We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you. So, Chairman Dutch, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished subcommittee members, good morning from Yemen, which is afternoon. A window of hope was opened when the new US administration declared its intent to take a different approach to the situation in Yemen, one focused on diplomacy rather than fueling the war. Every single effort towards peace and justice for Yemen over the last few years, including by many congressmen and women, is to be welcomed. With increased efforts advocating for peace and justice in Yemen, regional actors have used tricks to avoid pressure and to avoid their legal and ethical responsibilities. These actors have denied their involvement in the war, like Iran, declared their formal withdrawal from the war, like the United Arab Emirates, or hide behind a weak government, like Saudi Arabia. But it doesn't change the fact that these actors continue from behind their curtains to fight in Yemen with less cost to the regional actors and higher cost to the Yemeni civilians. Yemen has faced a series of military escalations that have undermined the state and delivered Yemen from Saada in the north to Socotra in the south to different armed groups supported by regional powers. In the latest military escalation, the Houthis launched an attack on Marib Governorate, where many of the country's internally displaced persons have taken shelter throughout the war. The international community should work towards an urgent ceasefire in Marib and across Yemen. The UN has described Yemen as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. I will say again, Yemenis are not starving, they are being starved. Yemen's humanitarian catastrophe can only be understood as linked to the ways in which the warring parties have carried out attacks in the total absence of accountability. The Saudi and Emirati-led coalition has hit farms, water points, and fishermen in their airstrikes, while the Houthis have laid landmines near food and water sources. All parties have obstructed and blocked humanitarian access. During 2020 alone, Mwatana documented more than 1,020 attacks impacting civilians or civilian objects by all parties to the conflict. These attacks killed and wounded at least 900 civilians, most of them women and children. In 2020 also, a coalition airstrike involving a US weapon, Valentine's Day, killed 32 civilians. Most of those killed were also women and children. Much needs to be done in Yemen, but there are some clear places to start. For many years, human rights and humanitarian groups have made the same set of demands that
Right, Ms. Almutawakel, hold on one second. Let's try to get the audio working. Okay. Now we hear you. Thank you.
Hear me now?
We can. Yes. Thank you.
Should I start again?
No, we heard you. You can pick up from where you were. You had cut out for a second.
Yeah. Okay. So open seas, Yemen sees land and airports, including Sana'a airports, end the siege of Taiz, pay public sector salaries, release those arbitrarily detained and forcibly disappeared, allow inspection and maintenance of the FSO SAFR, and all restrictions imposed on civil society and media. Such demands should be high on the list of the United States priorities in parallel with efforts towards accountability and peace. For many years, the US obstructed accountability efforts for Yemen. This should change. Yemen would not have been the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, except for the absence of accountability. Routes to accountability are very few. Warring parties have made their opposition clear. International routes might be our only chance. The US should not block the Security Council from referring Yemen to the International Criminal Court. The US should work with others to push for concrete accountability strategy, including justice for war crimes, reparations for victims, and support a UN investigations. Another thing that the US can do through the Security Council is to work with other states on a new resolution that provides an effective framework for peace and avoids the pitfalls of Resolution 2216. Almost 10 years ago, Yemen was a country trying to enter the world as a young democracy. Now, the war has created a safe environment for armed groups, but until this moment, the majority of Yemenis, when they think about their future, still think that the future should be living within a state that guarantees the rule of law and that respects democracy and justice. Yemenis look forward to the moment when the sustained and serious efforts will help them fulfill this dream. What the US does and says, including what Congress does and says, matters in Yemen. The US can make peace in Yemen more possible or less. It is as simple as that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Almutawakel. We're really grateful for your participation with us today. And Mr. Mohammed, if it's okay with you, I see the ranking member is here, and I'll turn it over to the ranking member for his opening comments, and then we'll come back to you, Mr. Mohammed. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Deutsch, and gosh, it's good to see you, and it was good to see you yesterday too, actually in person. That's amazing. So, hey, you look good. Congratulations, Mr. Chairman, on continuing your service as chairman of the subcommittee. It's been my pleasure to work with you and atop the subcommittee for the past 2 years, and I look forward to working with you in this Congress. Thank you for calling this meeting here today and hearing. And the situation in Yemen remains one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. One organization recently estimated that over 130,000 Yemenis have been killed since 2015. Food security in Yemen insecurity continues to increase, with 2 million children under the age of 5 at risk of malnutrition this year, and over half of the Yemenis may experience high levels of food insecurity in the first half of 2021. Today, we will hear from witnesses as we are now. How brave the witness is, and God bless you for your service, who are assisting and helping the people of Yemen. And what would the world do to ease their suffering? The American people have been generous donors to help the Yemeni people during both the Trump and Biden administrations. In fiscal year 2020, we provided over $630 million, and we've also provided $350 million so far in fiscal year 2021. We want to help, and we are helping. Tragically, the humanitarian response to this disastrous situation and devastation has consistently been hampered by the parties in the conflict. The Houthis obstructed humanitarian assistance to the point that last year the international community threatened to cut off all aid. In fact, the control and diversion of aid is one of the ways that Houthis and their partners pay for their operations. The United States ultimately suspended some of the assistance to Yemen because of the Houthis' bureaucratic impediments. I hope the witnesses today will update us on the hurdles they face in trying to provide life-saving assistance to the innocent Yemenis. Unfortunately, it's clear that the best and perhaps only option to significantly improve the humanitarian situation is to reach a political settlement. I appreciate the renewed attention by the administration in putting on diplomacy. However, I fear that lifting the designation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization without any actual behavioral changes by the Houthis has removed one of our most important leverages, particularly with their association with Iran. The Houthis continue to launch ballistic missile and drones into Saudi Arabia, threatening civilians. And right now, the Houthis are laying siege to the Yemeni citizen city of Marib, which many of Yemeni's internally displaced persons have relocated during the course of the war. I hope the witnesses today can provide a humanitarian update on the situation in March, as well as to understand the impact of continued fighting near the city. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from our very brave and esteemed witnesses. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. Appreciate it, and appreciate your leadership on the committee. Next, we will go to Mr. Mohammed. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairman Dutch, Ranking Member Wilson, and respected members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you on the dire humanitarian situation today in Yemen, and I'm testifying in my capacity as a policy advisor at Oxfam. For almost 6 years, civilians have endured unimaginable suffering due to the ongoing conflict. The parties are fighting at the expense of the vast majority of Yemenis who have seen their safety jeopardized, their livelihoods disrupted, their infrastructure destroyed, and most importantly, their social fabric and economic institutions torn apart. Since 2015, millions have been forced to abandon the plans they have made for their lives, with many bearing scars to their dignity and integrity. Government institutions and monetary systems are effectively divided and weaponized, with little to no regard to the consequences to civilians. Parties to this conflict regularly pay their soldiers, but not public servants, like nurses, doctors, and teachers, who have not been paid for years. Millions across the country continue to face multiple crises at once, as warring parties compete over economic roads, markets, and revenues, further pushing what's already a fragile economy to the edge, making living conditions unbearable for millions across the country. Today, one does not need to conduct a thorough assessment to find out about the struggles that Yemenis face. A walk on the streets would be enough to see impacts reflected on people's appearances, movement, and facial expressions. With only half of all the health facilities fully functional and incomes either wiped out or stagnating amidst skyrocketing inflation, over 15 million people have become vulnerable to preventable diseases like cholera, which has claimed more than 3,000 lives since 2017. COVID-19 is imposing a new deadly threat for which Yemenis are utterly unprepared. When the first case was reported last year, only 700 intensive care units beds, including 60 only for children, and 500 ventilators were available for a population of over 30 million. Yemen has almost no testing capacity, and most people are only tested when they are admitted to hospitals with severe symptoms. Authorities both in the north and south of the country gave up prevention measures months after the first case was recorded in April last year. People have largely suffered in silence due to distrust in the health system, social stigma, and economic barriers to treatment. With over 16 million hungry people and over 5 million facing acute food insecurity, Yemenis will face this pandemic with weaker defenses than nearly any group of people in the world. In the rare instances when Yemeni patients facing critical illness can afford treatment, many cannot access it thanks to the closure of Sana'a International Airport. Until the end of 2020, US administration's policies on Yemen have enabled this conflict and thus the suffering of millions across the country. The recent steps by President Biden to prioritize ending the conflict in Yemen and relieving suffering is welcome. It is important that the US follow through on these commitments, suspending any support that could fuel the conflict until there is a sustainable peace. I want to acknowledge the extraordinary role the US Congress played to support principled humanitarian action and inclusive peace in Yemen. In the legislation you have advanced, the advocacy you have conducted, and the oversight you conduct, such as through today's hearing. Your engagement has been thoughtful, bold, and focused. I hope you will continue to support peace and relief in Yemen by pressuring conflicting parties to commit to a nationwide ceasefire, mitigate COVID-19 risks, and commit to achieving a lasting and comprehensive peace. Yemen cannot wait. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed. Ms. Catanzano, I'm going to turn it over to you. As I do, I would note for the members that the current vote will be called at 10:50. So if anyone hasn't voted, I want to let you know that. And I may be heading over in a moment. Ms. Catanzano, please don't take that as a reflection of your testimony. You're now recognized. Thank you.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for convening this hearing and for your efforts to put humanitarian issues at the center of U.S. policy toward Yemen. And thank you to my colleagues for their invaluable perspectives. It's an honor to be alongside such remarkable humanitarian leaders today. The IRC has been operating in Yemen since 2012. Our staff, nearly all Yemenis, deliver vital humanitarian assistance across the country in both the north and south. Thanks in large part to generous U.S. funding, every week, the IRC delivers healthcare to 13,000 people, treats over 500 children for malnutrition, and helps hundreds of women safely deliver their babies. We provide clean water, emergency cash, job training, and support for women and children who've been victims of violence. While the humanitarian suffering in Yemen is tragic, it is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of a war that has put civilians in the crosshairs. The conflict is complex, but one truth is clear: the Yemeni people bear its brunt. While the crisis is protracted, it's not static. Yemenis are trapped in a hellish cycle. The international response treats the worst symptoms, but fails to address the conflict that drives the needs. Yemenis must confront new shocks with fewer resources, less resiliency, and the cycle restarts. So as we mark 6 years of conflict this month, the situation continues to unravel. Conflict is raging. Last year, airstrikes were up by over 80%, and the number of front lines exploded from 33 to 49. Yemenis are more likely to be killed in their homes than in any other building. 18 health facilities came under fire despite the pandemic, and amid a hunger crisis, an airstrike hit a farm or a market roughly every 10 days. While shocking indictments of the warring parties' disregard for international humanitarian law, and a reminder, the Yemenis are dealing not just with the war's destructive legacy, but its daily horrors. The economy is imploding. Yemen's import dependency made it uniquely vulnerable to COVID-19's disruptions to the global supply chain. Economic warfare by all parties further choked the import of food, fuel, and medicines. Prices soared, the currency collapsed, purchasing power plummeted. 3 in 5 Yemenis surveyed by the IRC could not afford basic items, and many are resorting to child labor and child marriages to ease expenses. Humanitarian action is constrained. While there were improvements last year, bureaucratic challenges, not conflict, accounted for over 90% of access incidents, including delays in program approvals and travel permits for staff. But despite these challenges, the biggest constraint to our work is the severe lack of funding, which has forced humanitarians to scale back in the face of spiraling need. The result? The world's worst humanitarian crisis is on track for its worst year yet. Famine alarms are ringing again, louder than ever, as half of all Yemenis are already going hungry, half of all Yemeni children under 5 are already severely malnourished. Preventing famine must be an urgent priority, and to this end, the U.S. should lift the USAID suspension on humanitarian assistance in the north, both to free up much-needed funding and to bolster U.S. efforts to push others to fill the response's dangerously empty coffers. To ensure aid gets to those most in need, the U.S. should lead multilateral efforts to ease bureaucratic obstacles in the north and south. But if the efforts end there, we'll be back here in 2 or 3 years' time making similar pleas. We're grateful for the sustained congressional pressure that has helped drive the U.S. policy away from a failed war strategy. And we applaud the Biden administration's steps to end support for offensive operations, pause arms sales, and appoint an envoy. We urge the U.S. to build on this momentum First, the US should throw its diplomatic weight behind the UN Special Envoy's efforts to secure a nationwide ceasefire. A halt to the fighting will protect civilians, facilitate aid delivery, and help build the confidence necessary for a meaningful political process. Second, Yemenis need affordable food and staples now. Humanitarians cannot replace a functioning economy. The US should press for the reopening of air and seaports and other steps necessary to facilitate import flows and stabilize the currency. And finally, a political settlement is the only way to end Yemen's humanitarian nightmare. Beyond the ceasefire, the US should focus diplomatic energy on an inclusive, forward-looking political process aimed at a durable peace agreement. With these steps, the US can help break the cycle, can keep Yemenis alive, and finally give them hope for a better future. I offer my sincere thanks to the subcommittee for its commitment to Yemen and Yemenis, and I thank you for this opportunity to share the challenges facing IRC and our Yemeni clients. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Catanzano, and thanks to all the witnesses for your testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each, pursuant to all time yielded for the purposes of questioning our witnesses, pursuant to House rules. And we'll recognize members by seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair directly. I am going to head to the floor to vote. So I will actually yield to the ranking member for his questioning first, and the committee vice chair, Ms. Manning, will take over until I get back. Should she not be back, then I see my friend and able colleague, Mr. Connolly, who is unaware of this, but I may ask him to sit in as well. Thanks very much, Mr. Wilson. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank all the witnesses, and your insight has been so helpful. And gosh, whatever can be done, working together with Chairman Deutsch, we're very happy to work together to assist you in your NGO efforts. With that in mind, and it's been pointed out, the implosion, but are there any jobs and industries still functioning in the country? Are the government workers still being paid by the government, the internationally recognized government? And is there any ability for port landings or other capabilities of imports or also exports? Each of you, if you could answer that, I'd appreciate it.
I'd love to defer to my Yemeni colleagues first and then come in after them.
Thank you.
Mohammed, you can go on.
I can go on unless Radhya would like to start.
No, Mohammed, you can go on. Go on, Mohammed.
All right, thank you, High-Ranking Member Wilson. Thank you very much for this question. Of course, over the past 6 years now, millions of Yemenis have seen their salaries being late. There have been a lot of irregularity in terms of paying salaries, as I have mentioned during my testimony, that all parties to the conflict have been regularly paying their soldiers, but not public servants. Over the past few years now, we have seen important or critical sectors, including the health sector, not being or not seeing their salaries paid on a regular basis, even during the times of COVID-19, during the first wave in 2020. And this has been the case over the past few years now. Now, the payment of salaries is very critical due to the deterioration in the economy, and living conditions have been unbearable for millions of Yemenis across the country. Over 50% of the families in Yemen have lost their jobs or lost their livelihoods due to this conflicts. and we have been witnessing rounds of severe currency depreciations and high rates of inflations across the country, which makes life even worse for millions across the country. And on the other side, also the multiple crises to which the blockade is a key component has been devastating lives across the country. We have witnessed rounds of fuel crisis across the country, mainly in the northern part of the country. We are still experiencing fuel crisis since June of last year. Now, in the northern part of the country, we are seeing probably the world's largest queues of cars on fuel stations across the northern part of the country, and also multiple crises also have been faced as well in the southern part of the country. I refer to my colleagues for further insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I will just add one thing to what Mohammed said about salaries. Those people who are living in the areas that is controlled by Houthis, which is the most of the population in Yemen, are not receiving their salaries since 2016. The Houthis, they don't consider themselves responsible to pay their salaries, and the government consider themselves not responsible to pay their salaries. So they are punished by both parties just because it happened that they are living in these areas.
The only thing I would add to what my colleagues have said is that restarting salaries to civil servants is such an urgent priority, not just because it will put much needed money in the pockets of those civil servants and help them support their families and spur local economies. It also will help build state capacity to deliver services within Yemen. And Yemenis have really suffered from this complete collapse of state services, and it's an overwhelming gap for humanitarians to try to fill. We cannot replace a functioning economy, and we cannot replace a functioning state. And so there is a lot tied to these civil servants receiving their salaries.
Thank you very much, each of you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Connolly, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Kind of fun to call you that. And thank you to our panel. This is an extraordinary, tragic story in our era. And maybe I can direct my first question, although the panelists can answer as well, but to Ms. Catanzano. I want to talk about refugees for a minute. Just real quickly, refresh our memory. What would be the total global number of Yemeni refugees, external and displaced internal, rough estimate?
Thank you, sir. An additional 170,000 Yemenis were displaced through conflict in 2020, bringing the total number of the internally displaced within Yemen to about 4 million.
4 million.
It's a record number for Yemen, but it's also one of the largest IDP populations on the planet.
Right.
With respect to refugee numbers, I would have to get back to you on a total for that. I think that really ties into the fact it's very much an internally displaced person crisis versus a refugee crisis, given how little opportunity Yemenis have to move internationally.
Right.
Airports and seaports are closed.
So let's just say, for planning purposes, we're looking at somewhere north of 4 million people. And in the Trump administration, a grand total of 6 people, 6 Yemenis, have been admitted to the United States as refugees, and 0 were resettled as of January 31 when he was leaving office. To me, that goes far beyond dereliction of duty. America has a responsibility, especially since it, for the longest time, was equipping and training the Saudis in their military operations in Yemen that certainly contributed to the refugee crisis. We have an obligation to alleviate some of the burden on the refugee side, and it is quite clear we did not do that. And it looks like it was a deliberate strategy What, wearing your nonprofit hat, but from your perspective, what happened? Why wasn't the United States more responsive? And what can the new Biden administration do? What should it do to really ramp that up to welcome Yemeni refugees and alleviate some of the pain and suffering as part of the American responsibility and burden?
Thank you, sir. The IRC responds to those caught in crisis overseas, but it's also resettles refugees in numerous cities across the United States. So this is an issue that hits near and dear to our heart. And we agree with you that the US has an obligation as a global leader, and that the refugee resettlement program has both symbolic meaning in the sense that it shows solidarity with those who've been affected by crisis, and quite frankly, solidarity with allies all over the world who host and will continue to host most of the refugees globally. In this particular crisis, we would hope to see the US both welcome Yemenis, but not just Yemenis. We think it's important for there to be a much bigger number of refugees resettled in the US every year, welcome the Biden administration's efforts to increase that number, because when the US leads, others follow. But when the US steps back, other nations step back as well. And global resettlement dropped everywhere in the world, not just in the US over the last 4 years. So we hope the US re-stepping into that global leadership role will spur refugee resettlement globally and not just in the US.
I think that's, I'm going to yield back, Madam Chairwoman, but I just think that's scandalous. 6 refugees in 4 years, 0 resettled as part of the American contribution to alleviating the extraordinary pain and suffering in Yemen. And to the point the gentlelady just made, it's important to remember that in the last year of the Obama administration, we had 125,000 refugees coming into the United States. In the last year of the Trump administration, 4 years later, that number had dropped to 15,000. And it is very clear we need to reverse that. America must live up to the poetic aspirations that are carved into the Statue of Liberty. I believe in that passionately, and I hope my colleagues do as well. I yield back, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Perry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sure appreciate the information and the hearing today. Thank you for having it. It seems pretty obvious to me, based on everything that I have read until recently, the Houthis were designated as a terrorist group, and they regularly control, divert, use the aid that we sent to bankroll their operations. And I think that donations have probably tapered off as a result of that. I mean, look, everybody wants to help. Every country wants to help. I think, I don't know what else to say other than we all want to help. But at the same time, what we don't want to do is help, help these Houthi rebels in their quest to, to take over the country. The last remaining stronghold, as I understand it, is Marib. What do we? I mean, I know that it's not necessarily in your lane here as humanitarian aid assisters to drag the Houthis to the table, but as long as we signal that we're going to no longer support the Saudis, and that I guess, I don't know, if we had Mr. Connolly's way, we would allow every single person in Yemen come to the United States and allow it to become a client state completely of Iran. I don't think that's the answer. I think the question really is
would my friend yield just for a second?
Now, let me ask my questions, Jerry, please, and then we can talk offline if we have to or what have you. But what kind of pressure can the humanitarian organizations place on everybody involved, especially the UN, to drive the Houthis to the table so that humanitarian assistance provided by your agencies, paid for in large part in some occasions by the American taxpayer, to get to the people that actually need it, as opposed to another event like in Somalia, where we're sending our hard-earned supplies and aid and assistance to the very people that we wish to disaffect, which is these Houthis that are causing this all in the first place. Anybody?
Can I take that?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. So the question is not how humanitarian NGOs can push, it's how the US, the Congress can push. Humanitarian NGOs, they have to deliver. We as a human rights NGOs, we documented in details all the restrictions and humanitarian access by Houthis, by other parties to the conflict. So we provided the information in order for states to push. So it's pressure. Independence, balanced pressure is still until this moment have not been experienced in Yemen. The US for the past 6 years were allies to Saudis and Emiratis. So, and when it comes to pressure, the question is how to push on all parties to the conflict. Because until this moment, in reality, in the ground, the impact of any pressure is still not have any signs by any party to the conflict. Still, even Sana'a airport is not closed. It's not, opened. Still, Houthis and other parties to the conflict are committing their violations. So that's why I have talked about accountability. So for pushing in peace in one line, also we have to push for accountability and to search for mechanisms for accountability. And pressure, when it is independent and balanced, it can do a lot. If we as a local human rights NGOs can do a lot, and we are in the middle of armed groups, just because we have our independent pressure, then you can imagine if this independent pressure is globally, is from the most powerful states like the US. So to cut the aid, it's not the solution. To be silent regarding the violations by Houthis and restrictions by Houthis in the humanitarian aid, it's not the other solution. There's something in the middle to practice pressure, and it will work, and you know how to do it.
I'm not suggesting that we cut the aid, but I am suggesting that that we need to be doing more to drive the Houthis to the table, and it seems like that's the issue that no one wants to talk about. It's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, it's difficult, I get it, but sending aid that eventually goes to the Houthis and they use it against the express purposes or express goals doesn't seem to be a solution set. Let me ask you this, ma'am, because I agree with you regarding the pressure, and I think it should be relentless across every single sector, including from the top of the United States government, the administration, and certainly NGOs. Look, I don't think it's their strongest suit, but I think that they have a role to play there. Do you know of any way that the United States could deliver the aid differently, such that it wouldn't fall into the Houthis' hands and be used against our express goals and your express goals and purposes?
Yes, again, it's the pressure. I want to talk about taking or pushing Houthis to the table. It's not the big elephant here. It's what is have to be done. This is how peace is going to be processed. And I will remind you that after the Khashoggi murder, for the first time, there was a real pressure on parties to the conflict to go to the table. And in 2 months, the United States succeeded to send Houthis and other parties to the conflict to Stockholm to start a peace process. It didn't maybe went well, but it succeeded because there was a kind of pressure in a certain moment. So it's not about how to deliver the aid, it's how to change the attitude in a way that you can tell all parties to the conflict that they have to respect the international humanitarian law, the international law for human rights, and they should not prevent or do anything against the humanitarian access. Now the new approach of the US administration is still very new. In order to be a fact, in order to have its impact, there are still many steps that the US should do. And as a human rights defender, I will suggest things like going towards serious accountability mechanisms, criminal accountability. And I talked about the ICC and that I hope that states will push to refer the Yemen situation to the ICC.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairwoman, a point of personal privilege. Before you recognize Mr. Cicilline, this is Jerry Connolly.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I just want to take direct issue with what Mr. Perry just did. My remarks were to point out that only 6 Yemeni refugees had been allowed in the United States, and that was too few. Never once did any of my colleagues hear me say all Yemeni refugees ought to be allowed into the United States. To mischaracterize my position, frankly, I take as a personal affront. And the fact that Mr. Perry, of course, would not allow me a moment to clarify that only puts salt in the wound. I wish in the future we'd be careful about characterizing each other's statements. I thank the chairwoman for allowing me that point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Cicilline?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to begin by thanking Chairman Deutsch and Ranking Member Wilson for holding this important hearing today, and thank our witnesses for being here. We gather at a moment where we know the horrors of conflict, the scourge of disease, and the wretchedness of hunger that are beleaguering the people of Yemen, and really testing our commitment to peace and human rights. International agencies, NGOs, and the witnesses on the ground have reiterated that the crisis in Yemen represents the greatest humanitarian challenge in the world today. Today, 16 million Yemenis are food insecure. Over 2 million children require treatment for acute malnutrition. Over 1 million pregnant and breastfeeding women require treatment for acute malnutrition. And famine-like conditions are expected to triple in multiple regions of the country. The conditions in Yemen amount to both a human tragedy and a colossal failure of the international community to act on behalf of the Yemeni people. However, the previous administration engaged the situation in a manner that lacked imagination, indulged the misguided foreign policy of traditional partners in the region, and exacerbated a situation that neglected the well-being of millions of Yemenis. It's evident that our engagement in Yemen has been, to this point, contradictory to our nation's values and the virtues of human rights and humanitarianism. And it's important that we endeavor to pursue a more just solution to the crisis in Yemen so that the Yemeni people may soon know peace again. And so my first question is, we have seen lots of reporting about the Houthis obstructing delivery of humanitarian assistance through attempted coercion or skimming. And are the Houthis still engaged in these actions? And what measures are implementers taking to protect assistance and avoid this kind of obstruction? And how can the United States and the international community assist? Any of the witnesses that can respond to that.
Do you want me to respond? Okay.
I'm going to go now, but I'm going to make a little.
Okay.
I'm happy to take that one first and pass it off to my colleagues if that's okay.
Great.
No doubt.
Yeah, and I have a couple more questions, so I'd like to try to get to those as well.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead. No, I'm saying after you answer.
Got it. Yemen's a difficult operating environment in the north and the south. I don't think any humanitarian would argue otherwise. But humanitarian organizations like the ones you're hearing from today, IRC, Oxfam, we deliver in challenging conflict settings all over the world. So it's not a completely new environment for us or new challenges for us. We're seeing fragile progress in terms of improving some of the bureaucratic impediments that we've faced over the years. It's fragile, but it's moving in the right direction. That said, I want to be really clear. Humanitarians work hard not to accept diversion. As we do in any context, we and other humanitarian actors halt activities if they face interference or unacceptable risks of diversion or other measures that violate our humanitarian principles. We make the tough decisions to stop programming. When that happens, vulnerable people lose out. We have stringent accountability and monitoring mechanisms that we impose and that donors impose to help ensure high levels of scrutiny. Despite these impediments, the aid operation is still delivering in Yemen. Last year, aid agencies like the ones you're hearing from today helped more than 10 million people a month, delivering principled humanitarian assistance in every single one of Yemen's 333 districts. We do face constraints on getting the travel permits we need, or getting the visas that we need to get our staff into place, or getting signatures on the agreements that we need to launch programming. But I really can't stress enough, given this severity of the need, the biggest threat to our operations in 2021 is the lack of funding, not the lack of access. We can indeed deliver principled humanitarian assistance across the country.
Great, thank you. And that actually leads to my final question. You know, all of the witnesses, you have all provided, I think, very useful recommendations regarding U.S. policy changes. And obviously that's important, but what do you think is the single most important thing that we can do to address the humanitarian crisis right now? If each of the witnesses could just give their kind of best recommendation for the single most important thing we could be doing right now.
I think you're going to hear a lot of the same: an immediate ceasefire and an end to the conflict. This is a humanitarian crisis that's driven by the conflict and the cruelty with which it's conducted. Ending the war with a political settlement is the only way out of this humanitarian disaster.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cicilline, and thanks to our Vice Chair, Kathy Manning. I will now turn it over to Mr. Mast for 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you recognizing me. Thank you to our witnesses for coming and sharing your experiences. I'm going to ask for some specifics on this, and I guess make a comparison in this way. Are you all, to our witnesses, are you familiar with the name Mohammed Farah Adid? Do any of you witnesses recognize that name? That's the warlord that we were fighting as we were in conflict in giving aid in Somalia. And it goes to this question: who is the least of all evils in terms of warlords that are out there taking control on the ground that you think the United States of America should be working with?
What do you mean by working with?
Ma'am, could you repeat? I didn't quite hear you.
Sorry, I just said, what do you mean by working with?
In terms of making sure that the aid that we put on the ground gets to those that need assistance, going back to the last question that was being answered by Ms. Catanzano. Those on the ground that are not going to take the aid that is sent, use it for a leverage to hurt those that we are intending to help. The ground is run by warlords. Who is the least of all evils that you would suggest that we work with?
Okay, so in that concept, I will let Amanda answer, but in that concept, no one. We have in Yemen different parties to the conflict, same manner. The only partner for you in this, it's humanitarian NGOs. But parties to the conflict, all of them, they do violations when it comes to humanitarian access. Horrible violations, all of them. So the only way that you can push on them to change their attitude, to respect the humanitarian access, and to support humanitarian NGOs to feel stronger in facing all what's happening in the ground.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your honest and candid response. It's important as we reflect upon how we respond, how, where, or why, or when we respond with aid. So I thank you for that candid response. I would just say this: I'm sympathetic, no doubt, and I'm always more sympathetic when there is a partner to work with. What is the scope of fleeing conflict that we are witnessing right now? Give me some numbers, if you can, on how many are seeking to find a new home, to travel to some other land? What is the scope of that right now?
Mohammed and Amanda.
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for this question. Now there are close to 4 million internally displaced people across the country, and this is mainly prompted by the ongoing fighting across the country as well. And these people, more people are being displaced by the day, and it is important to note that millions of people also have been displaced more than one time, which makes it hard for people just to find or to seek a refuge in a safe place. I just want also to reiterate on what my colleagues have already said, that we as an international humanitarian organization, we firstly defend the principles of impartiality and independence in Yemen. This means that when parties to the conflict, when any parties to the conflict, for example, or government authorities, whenever they attempt to impose unacceptable conditions on our work, we are sometimes forced to pause the delivery of life-saving while we negotiate. We have been able to help millions of people while we maintain our principled humanitarian response across the country. And when we are forced to, for example, suspend our programs, unfortunately, it is the most vulnerable people in Yemen who pay the price for these delays. But just to reiterate, we do not accept any the diversions of aid or any attempts towards this direction. Thank you very much.
Responses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. Mr. Liu, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for calling this important hearing. I believe it was wrong when the Obama administration supported the Saudi-led military coalition in Yemen. I believe it was wrong when the Trump administration did the same. It's one reason I had legislation that banned the U.S. from refueling these Saudi-led coalition jets. And it's because they were committing war crimes. They were targeting civilians nowhere near military targets. They were bombing wedding parties, civilian markets, schools, hospitals, any number of civilian sites. And I believe it was a massive number of war crimes that the Saudi-led coalition engaged in. I am particularly struck by the testimony this morning by Ms. Almutawakel, where you said that the Yemenis are not starving, they are being starved. And you said that these airstrikes are also targeting farms and other agricultural production facilities. So I want to ask you, do you have evidence that the Saudi-led coalition is in fact going after the food production sector in Yemen?
Thank you. So when it comes to starvation, it's one of the most difficult violations to document from a human rights angle because you have to prove the pattern. So in our investigation, we could find a pattern in airstrikes where food production was targeted, but it's not only the airstrikes. As I said, it's also landmines by Houthis and also the humanitarian access. There was violence by different parties to the conflict, including airstrikes by the Saudis and Emiratis that prevent people from their source of income. Yes, and this is one of the reasons that led to the starvation and make it like using starvation as a weapon of war. It's the very direct attacks. It's part of it, and still there are many other factors, which can be also violations.
Thank you. I note that Saudi Arabia is a signatory to the August 1949 Geneva Convention Additional Protocol, which specifically states that it is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. such as foodstuffs, agricultural areas for the production of foodstuffs, crops, livestock, and so on. So in addition to war crimes, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is also violating the Geneva Convention, and they simply need to stop. Now, I think it's not enough for the U.S. to simply stop helping Saudi Arabia wreak devastation across Yemen. I think the U.S. has to take affirmative efforts to fix a situation that we help cause. So the port of Hodeidah, could Saudi Arabia help open that up right now if pressure is put on Saudi Arabia by the United States? And anyone can answer that.
Maybe I can start and let Abdulwasea take over as well, because he's very knowledgeable on this. I think there is pressure that should be put on all parties regarding what's happening at Hodeidah. There are no clean hands here. All parties are failing Yemenis. There are certainly—
Actually, let me just, thank you. Let me just stop you right there. But the U.S. clearly took a side. We clearly supported the Saudi-led coalition that engaged in multiple war crimes. So we don't seem like an honest broker. You know, it seems like we've got to, if we want to seem like an honest broker, then actually start taking actions that don't preference one side. So let me just say that. Sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. And I think that that's reasonable. The U.S. has had a particular role with a particular party of the conflict and has a responsibility to bring that party and all parties to the table and pressure those parties to take steps that will alleviate humanitarian suffering. I think the point that I was trying to make is that there's a two-step process that needs to happen for Hodeidah Port to be to facilitate the flow, particularly of fuel right now through Hodeidah Port, as we've seen this crisis over fuel transpire over the last 8 months and really hit, I think, its low point since January, considering there's been hardly any fuel coming into the country through Hodeidah since January 3rd. But this is a stalemate between both the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition in terms of negotiating around revenue sharing. So there's pressure that needs to be put on everyone. But yes, there's a role that the U.S. plays in getting the Saudis to take some first steps here. But I think it's important to remember there's a two-step process here. It's not as simple as just opening the floodgates, because there's a stalemate in this discussion.
Thank you. My real quick last question. Do you think the U.S. should sanction Saudi officials or Houthi officials or Iranian officials who have engaged in war crimes or efforts that they took to stop humanitarian aid from going to the Yemeni population?
From a humanitarian perspective, we'd like to see diplomatic levers used to increase access. It's not our place to make a legal judgment on whether war crimes have been committed or not, but we do see the impact of the denial of access on populations in the north and the south. And we're as committed as the United States government is to the delivery of principled humanitarian assistance based on need, and we support U.S. and other donors engaging all actors to facilitate the delivery of principled aid. So I think that specific steps like sanctions, I don't know what that would do. There's been sanctions on the Houthis for senior leaders for a number of years. That doesn't seem to have changed the calculus, but we're also very concerned about what sanctions can mean for commercial imports and for humanitarian work, given lack of clarity around humanitarian exceptions and the risk that commercial importers are willing to entail in a context like that.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I still have time to say something.
If it's okay, Ms. Almutawakel, we're going to move on, and I'm sure you will have an opportunity. If not, I'll certainly give you one later. Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mr. Burchett, you're recognized.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to follow my friend Ted Liu. I appreciate his tough stand, and I look forward to working with him in the future. But in y'all's opinion, what does the delisting of the Houthis from the State Department's Foreign Terrorist Organization list mean for the situation on the ground? And would it have made more sense for the Biden administration to get something in return for the delisting, maybe the end of the Houthi advance around Marib? Can any of y'all answer that, please?
Amanda, do you want me to go on?
Go ahead, ma'am.
Okay. So complications is a common sense in any war, right? And this war has started in 2014, and since then we have many escalations. The more complicated one is towards Marib by Houthis. So the new approach of the U.S. should be should have other actions in order to have its impact. It's very early to have an impact of the U.S. New approach only by saying that the new approach is this and this. There are many steps that should be done. If this independent, balanced approach and pushing for peace and accountability continue from the U.S., it will lead to something, and it will maybe Houthis, they think that negotiations are very close. That's why they started to escalate, because the war is the only thing they understand, and they're afraid from pushing them towards peace. So the only thing that the U.S. can do with its new approach is to keep pushing for peace and accountability. It's because we have 6 years of wars that had nothing, that didn't weaken any party to the conflict. It just weakened us as people and civilians. So we have tried the war a lot and it didn't work. So the only one thing that we still have is to keep pushing for peace and accountability.
All right, thank you. Any of the others? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Thank you very much. Just to add to what my colleague has mentioned, from what I understood from your question is what could have been the impacts of the designation. Just to say, the FTO designation would have happened in a time where Yemen is already the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And the FTO designation would have direct and indirect disastrous consequences. The decision would have blocked, humanitarian aid, including the U.S. Goods would have been even blocked, or even obstructions would have been, on the way for supplies to come into the country. And also, as well, personnel would have difficulties to entering the northern part of Yemen as well, where 70% of, close to 70% of Yemen's population live. And this will substantially reduce the presence also of humanitarians throughout the rest of the country. It would have also come at a time where hunger and disease also has grabbed hold of the country, and humanitarian actions can ill afford the further limitations in funding and the fallout of this decision in the form of further curtailment, I would say, of access as retribution. Thank you very much.
All right, brother. Okay. Anybody else? All right.
Just to reiterate, this strategic ends of the designation, I think we deemed would have been minimal at best, and it would have come at an unacceptable humanitarian cost. And I don't think that our concerns were theoretical or hyperbolic. In November, just based on the rumor of designation, the UN reported decreases in commercial imports of food. For a country that's 90% reliant on imports of anything that slows down the commercial sector in that way would have been a death sentence. And then we only have to look to the recent past of Somalia to see the complications of introducing terrorism designations in the middle of a complex humanitarian crisis. There were a lot of factors that led to such massive harm in Somalia, but the fact that humanitarians were under such limitations based on those designations was certainly a part of it.
Okay. Why are the Houthis restricting the access of humanitarian agencies, and what can be done to make sure that this critical aid reaches the people who need it?
Yes, I will say just one thing on the designation. The designation didn't, didn't make Houthis weaker, and to revoke the designation didn't make them stronger. The only impact of designation was in civilians. It has nothing to do about the badness of Houthis and their desire to expand their military interventions. They are doing this since 2014 and even before. The humanitarian access, because this question has been said a lot. you know, even if there is a full humanitarian access to all Yemenis, you cannot feed a nation. Humanitarian aid will not solve the problem. This war should stop, and Yemenis should have their salaries and should have their lives back and jobs back in order to start feeding themselves. Humanitarian aid is very important to fill the gap, and it's a lifeline for millions. But now it's the millions are in the famine of in the brink of famine. So humanitarian aid will not feed all those people. Only to stop the war and to go to peace, a real peace process, and to help to try to do progress and accountability will help Yemenis to have their lives back and feed themselves back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chair Manning, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On top of all of the other disasters that you have been discussing there, I know that you mentioned the impact of COVID and the fact that the numbers are probably lower than reported, but I want
there you go.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted again.
There you are.
Okay, we'll try it again. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit more about what kinds of efforts are being taken to mitigate the impact of COVID. I can't imagine what it must take to do social distancing, masking, whether there are vaccines available. I wonder if you could talk to us about what the situation is on the ground and what additional measures can be taken to address this issue. Whoever would like to take it.
Yeah, I'd like to go first, if it's okay with my colleagues. Yeah, thank you very much, Congresswoman, for this important question. COVID-19 has been an issue that Yemen is not ready for. As I mentioned in my testimony, Yemen has the lowest capacity when it comes to the health system. Only 50% of all the health facilities are functional at the moment. And when it comes to COVID-19, there is a very low testing capacity across the country. Now we are fearing that the deadly virus is spreading undetected and also unreported, unfortunately. And this is because of many factors, including the distrust of Yemenis with their health systems. Something that we should also note is that millions of Yemenis, actually over 15 million Yemenis, they lack access to proper medical care across the country. This means that, I mean, when it comes to COVID-19, people, they don't seek treatment at medical facilities. They are only admitted to hospitals when they have severe symptoms, and they are only tested when they are admitted to the hospitals. When it comes to prevention measures, unfortunately, prevention measures have been given up across the country. And also there is a sense of public denial to the risks of COVID-19. This is mainly because of the lack of reporting in some parts of the country, including in the north, where authorities think that having reports out to the public would create a sort of public panic, which could not be the best strategy. We are concerned that the virus is spreading as we speak across the country undetected. We are also seeing growing patterns of cases from the few officially reported cases from southern the country, and not yet prevention measures are in place, especially around key entry points to the country or from the country to outside, which is quite alarming. And also, it is very alarming that when prevention measures in place, it could also affect people across the country who are struggling to make food to the table. As I mentioned earlier, over 50% of families across the country have seen their livelihoods disrupted. And having prevention measures, including lockdowns, would make life even further devastating for millions of families across the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any vaccine that's made its way into the country yet?
Is there, Mohammed?
Has there been any vaccine that's made its way into the country yet?
Well, from recent reports, we have heard from the IRG that they have secured a sort of shipments for vaccines, and there will be around 350,000 vaccines that would be coming to the country, and there would be prioritization for the elderly and the vulnerable groups. I am not sure if the vaccines have already made it to the country yet, but even when they are, I mean, looking at the numbers, they are very low, and given that we have a large number of vulnerable groups in the country, especially that we have over 4 million IDPs across the country living in settlements and makeshifts, and the living conditions they are experiencing are very harsh. And you can just imagine it is quite impossible to impose prevention measures where they live in condensed places.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chair Manning. We've also been joined today by Representative Omar, member of the full Foreign Affairs Committee. I ask unanimous consent that she be permitted to participate in today's subcommittee hearing. Hearing no objections, Ms. Omar, thank you for joining us at this hearing. And Mr. Keating, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this really important meeting and working it around roll calls and other issues, because the timing of this is so important. So the urgency and the priority that you've done as chair, moving this meeting so much forward is really important. I would like to just talk about, there's been a lot of discussions about human rights violations and accountability, which is important. They include violations by the Saudi-led coalition, rightfully so. But I wanted to just see, in terms of a little depth on the issues, the reports of Houthi hostage-taking, their attacks on journalists, women, on the civilian infrastructure, religious minorities. They're targeted beyond just military, considerations. Can you comment on those in a little more depth as well, and why they're targeted, as well as on the issue of what the international community can do to really target and confront those kind of violations?
Thank you. So when it comes to the violations, if you want me to tell you all the violations about Houthis, then I can give you 600 pages, just like other parties to the conflict. So it's landmines, ground chilling, preventing humanitarian access, torture, forcibly disappearance, restrictions, attacks on hospitals and schools, attacks on journalists and media. And they share many of this with the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition. They share it with the Yemeni government and armed groups loyal to the Yemeni government and armed groups loyal to the United Arab Emirates. When it comes, I just have an advice, I keep saying it. When you see the map of parties to the conflict in Yemen, never try to search for the good guy. And never try to make one guy is the bad guy. Because all parties to the conflict are committing horrible violations, war crimes, all of them. And the only way, and they do this because they trust impunity more than anything else. They never think they will be held accountable. That's why accountability is very important. that one of the things that push Yemen to be the worst humanitarian crisis is a huge lack of accountability. So mechanisms of accountability, this is one of the things that the US can explore with other states. What are the mechanisms of criminal accountability that can be used in order to hold all those people accountable, all parties to the conflict? This will even push for peace and will maintain peace, and it will also protect civilians in the future if there is another war. Many of the violations by Saudis, Emiratis, and Houthis and their allies, it's very preventable. Many ground shelling by Houthis, for example, happened in populated areas where they can prevent it. The same thing with the airstrikes. Many of the cases of detention and torture has no reason. So it's the lack of accountability. This is the question and the answer. So if there is a mechanism of accountability, whatever it is, that target all parties to the conflict equally, it will make difference regarding the violations in Yemen.
Yeah, well, thank you. You said the words "in the future," and pray that in the near future there'll be a durable political solution and the civil war will have ended. What type of infrastructure needs, if we're prioritizing things? I think you're correct. Part of it is accountability when the peace comes, accountability now, but also afterwards. But also infrastructure priorities. Should we be thinking about what we should, tee up for the greatest needs should we come to a peace?
So the infrastructure in Yemen was destroyed in many, many levels. The very few and limited infrastructure that we already have has been destroyed. Part of them are the hospitals and schools. We have documented many incidents where the hospitals and schools were attacked by airstrikes or ground shelling, and also homes. Many people they lost their homes, and for the Yemenis, the home is part of your family. It's not easy to have a home, and now thousands of Yemenis they lost their homes. In addition to everything that has been struck in Yemen, everything that has been destroyed when it comes to infrastructure. I don't know if my colleagues have priorities in this. Do you?
Well, clearly hospitals and housing are great priorities. If the other witnesses don't have any at this time, I think those are points to bring forward, along with criminal accountability as well. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for having this hearing.
Thank you very much, Chairman Keating. Next, I yield 5 minutes to Congressman Sherman. You're recognized.
Well, thank you, Chairman Deutsch. In most terrible catastrophes, the number of deaths caused by kinetic action, by arms themselves, is rather small compared to those who die of famine and disease. The briefing materials I was given for this hearing tells me that we've seen 130,000 deaths in Yemen, and I believe that number is quite a bit understated. Can the witnesses give me their best guess as to how many people have died in Yemen? And if at all possible, how many from kinetic action, bullets and bombs, and how many from famine and disease? Why don't we start with Mr. Mohammed and then go to Ms. Almutawakel.
Yes, thank you.
It'd be helpful if you could just give me a number or two. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I don't have insights to this one, so I'm gonna refer to my colleagues.
Okay.
Thank you.
One of the problems.
And I realize how difficult it is to put a number. Just give me what you identify as the best guess, and I know how difficult it is.
Yeah. For example, we in Mwatana only in 2020, and we document only the very direct human rights violations. We documented incidents where 900 people, civilians, were killed and injured, and most of them are women and children. So we documented hundreds of airstrikes and ground shelling and landmines and live bullets where a lot. We document. We don't have a general number because we are dying because of many reasons. Not one.
In terms of taking a particular picture of victims.
Yeah.
One person shot deliberately by a sniper, and I know the Houthi were deliberately shooting at children in one instance. One mortar round at civilians. One group of 12 people gathered and shot for no reason. These are horrendous, and yet what has killed hundreds of thousands, I believe, of Yemenis is the interruption in farming, the interruption in food aid, the famine, and the lack of treatment, worse yet during a COVID crisis worldwide. I don't know if our third witness wants to volunteer anything more specific or whether I should move on to the next question.
I'm happy to jump in, Congressman. Thank you. I mean, the UN has used numbers along the lines of the crisis already being responsible for the deaths of about 233,000 people, over half of whom were due to lack, like you said, lack of food and health services and other infrastructure. Those numbers date back to 2019, so they don't reflect the latest. But it has been projected that if the conflict lasts until the end of next year, there could be nearly 500,000 deaths, and 3 out of 5 of those would be due to, as you suggest, the indirect causes from infrastructure damage, from health facilities being knocked offline, from the economic impacts and lack of access to food.
Ms. Almutawakel, the Houthi have been imposing, a quote tax on aid organizations. Plus, there's the corruption. Plus, there's the seizure. Plus, there is over 200 shipping containers dealing with the treatment from COVID and PPE that have all been blocked by the Houthi. Can you detail for us what the Houthi have done to interrupt aid and to expose Yemenis to death?
Do you mean regarding collecting money from every possible source?
Yeah, so they demand money from every source. Do they then seize the food and give it only to their own supporters?
Right. We have documented cases where this have been approved in many incidents. Yes.
And one thing that I see in many parts of the world is the United States and sometimes our allies, as air power, they have a moral obligation, legal obligation to only hit military targets. There's always the occasional mistake, and the Saudis are particularly prone to mistakes. But that creates the most riveting picture, but is responsible for maybe 1% of the deaths in a conflict. Whereas I think as we've explored here, the majority, and I would say the vast majority, come from the interruption of farming and then the interruption of aid, medical and food. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Schneider, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this very important hearing. To our witnesses, I can't thank you enough for sharing your experiences, sharing your insights and perspectives and guidance on what others have already noted is the worst humanitarian crisis we have in the country, in the world at the moment. My question for everyone, but maybe I'll start with you, Ms. Almutawakel. With the crisis raging, and I was particularly struck by your comment that don't look for bad, don't look for good, it's spread all around, but let's look how we can help the Yemeni people. What steps can we in the United States take immediately to try to improve the conditions of the crisis, and at the same time signal this sense of accountability that you talk about, the immediate things to give relief at the moment?
So I don't know if the immediate this can work, but there are many priorities I have mentioned in my speech, like opening Sana'a airport or opening the sea and ground and airports in Sana'a, pushing for this, I mean. There are many files that can be worked on, even if the war is still going on. There are many things that can be done in order to make the situation less miserable. For example, the salaries of parties to the conflict pushed only to solve the problem of salaries, it will make a huge difference. The salaries is one of the things that really broke the back of Yemenis. And there are many Yemenis who are dying behind the closed doors. They will never go to ask even for humanitarian aid because they used to have a source of income like academic, doctors, teachers. Those people are dying and no one is noticing. Those the salaries is one of the very urgent things that can be solved even if the war is still going on. So to push, for example, the salaries issue is going to make a huge difference.
Great, thank you. Ms. Mohammed, Ms. Catanzano, anything you can think of?
I would agree with that. I mean, I don't think we can stress enough that the only way out of this humanitarian crisis is a political settlement. And there's a lot that the US can do to bring us closer to that. First, with an immediate ceasefire and with a political negotiation following that. But
yeah, let me, so not to interrupt, but that's a perfect segue to my next question, which may give you a broader platform. Oh. So yeah, the question, so the first question was immediate to try to change conditions for people suffering now, but there is an intermediate and long-term steps we can take both within Yemen and outside Yemen to give the best chance for the Yemeni people to take their own destiny back, build their own country, and go forward. What can we do in that context?
Apologize for jumping ahead on your question, sir. But I think that in addition to the things that my colleague already laid out that we can do immediately to improve the economic picture and the humanitarian picture, as I first mentioned, I think putting our sights on a ceasefire immediately, both because it can protect civilians, it can facilitate the delivery of aid, and it can be a confidence building measure for something that's more durable and more forward looking. The next step is to build off of that and to support a UN-led, inclusive, forward-looking peace process. The US and its allies, particularly the UK, have a role to play in establishing the framework for those discussions with the eye towards a political solution. The framework that has been in existence for the last 6 years hasn't been an on-ramp to meaningful discussions. It's been a bit of an impediment to it. It isn't forward-looking, it isn't inclusive. It really focuses on two parties, while we know that this conflict has really devolved and splintered, and there's many potential spoilers. I think there's a real need to be more inclusive, to bring women into the conversation, to bring youth into the conversation, and to be more reflective of the realities on the ground and how many actors there are engaged in this conflict, so that the framework for peace is one that takes that into account and is forward, like I said, forward-looking and therefore more likely to be durable.
Great, thank you. And I have just a few seconds left. If I want to go back, it was earlier noted by my colleague, Mr. Connolly, that only 6 Yemeni refugees have been admitted into this country over the last 4 years out of, I think the number was 4 million displaced persons. And a response was fear of losing our nation or becoming a client of another nation. Refugees who seek to come here, obviously there's a vetting process, there is security considerations, but these refugees who come to our country from all over the world have brought not just their traditions, but have brought energy and innovation and strength to our nation. Refugees from the Middle East, from Europe, from Africa, from Latin America, from the entire world, and have helped driven our economy, strengthened our communities, made our nation a better place. We need to be a light unto other nations and be a place that all people look to for guidance. And as someone else said, I think it was you, Ms. Catanzano, is when the US doesn't lead, other countries don't pick up the slack. We have to lead. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schneider. And with that, I'm pleased to give 5 minutes to Ms. Omar. Representative Omar.
Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity to come and participate in your committee. And thank you to my colleague from Illinois for that wonderful remark on refugees. I certainly agree with that assessment as a refugee myself. Miss Almutawakel, it's really nice to see you again. I want to ask you about civilian casualties as part of the conflict, which we discussed when we met 2 years ago. Your organization in 2020 was quoted as saying it's another year of impunity. And I wanted to get a concrete understanding of what your vision of justice in Yemen would look like.
Thank you. And it's really nice to see you again. And thank you for following our statement. So, you know, the war in Yemen, it's not actually civil war. It has this local dimension. It has also regional dimension, and it has international dimension. So when we talk in Mwatana about accountability, we mean international accountability. So its mandate can include all these parties to the conflict. And we have been, and I tell you that we were shocked to what extent the whole world is designed in a way that enhances impunity. It's not easy to search for mechanisms for accountability internationally, but we are feeling that we are digging the wall. But supporting, for example, the independent investigations from the Human Rights Council, like the GEE, and asking for IIIM, it lay the ground for criminal accountability, which is very important. And internationally, we all need to think about what mechanism that can be worked. I hope that we all work for this, not for only Yemen, for all countries who are still experiencing these horrible violations. What are the available mechanisms for account? The problem that in Yemen, most of the keys of accountability is in the hands of the Security Council. And we all know it's very political and there are some problems with it. Anyway, we are searching together.
So it sounds like you're saying that the impunity exists is because of the political realities of those who are involved in the conflict, and that's what's making it hard for the Yemenis to receive justice in this moment.
It's you know, that, for example, we have tried the universal jurisdiction. The first question we have asked from our international partners, do you have a Yemeni diaspora in the Europe? We don't have a Yemeni diaspora because we are stuck in Yemen. There is a curse of geography. People cannot flee like what happened in Syria. So that make even using the universal jurisdiction more complicated. We filed a complaint in Italy, by the way, regarding one of the incidents where the whole family were killed, and we found remnants of weapons, like it was Italian. We're trying to search for, but this is from the angle of weapons and arms trade. But we want in Mwatana to have a mechanism of accountability that targets all parties to the conflict, local and regional, and even their allies.
Right. And has there been a famine declared in Yemen at the moment?
It's like maybe Amanda can answer regarding the famine.
There is not an official declaration of famine. It's often hard for the data to be collected to keep up with the realities on the ground. Right now, there's about 16 million people, which is half of the population, that is going hungry. Half of the children under age of 5 are severely malnourished. And it is, there are pockets of the population that we believe to be experiencing famine-like conditions. The term famine is a very technical one. So I think we should make no mistake, there are people who are starving, and like my colleagues have said, they are being starved. And when you wait or look for that technical declaration, people have already died.
Right. I do appreciate that distinction. There was a famine declared in my home country of Somalia in 2011, and the world reacted differently. And so I'm wondering if you have an assessment of what difference it would make if that declaration was made in Yemen and how the world might respond.
I think that's an interesting question. I think I would need to be convinced, unfortunately, that it would make a big difference given how close we are teetering on the edge and how loud UN and the World Food Program and other NGOs like the ones you're hearing from today have been ringing those alarm bells and how it's been cyclical. And yet at the pledging conference last week, there was such a disappointing outcome when it came to donor dollars on the table and a nearly $2 billion shortfall to address these spiraling needs. And so certainly there needs to be something to really underscore the calamity that we're facing here. Whether an official declaration or not would change that, but I am concerned about this cycle of famine risk and what it takes to break it. And I think at the end of the day, we know it's not just about donor checks, though they solve the immediate problem. It's the need for a political process. It's the need to end the violence, because this is a famine driven by man-made decisions. This is hunger driven by the conflict and the cruelty with which it's conducted, and how it puts civilians in the infrastructure that they rely on in its crosshairs. So until that reality is dealt with, we'll continue to come back here looking and shaking our tin cup for those resources to save lives, but not putting in place the building blocks we need to build better futures.
Right. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Chairman, for the generosity with time.
Of course, thank you, Ms. Omer. Thanks for joining us today. I will now yield myself 5 minutes. I want to pick up where you left off, Ms. Catanzano. There's been talk, appropriately so, a lot of it, about accountability. I'd just like to ask you about accountability for the world community in meeting the needs on the ground at a time when, as you point out, half of the population is going hungry. We can point to commitments made, but it's not enough. What more can we do? I'll ask you, and actually I'll ask all of our witnesses, what more can we do to ensure that the rest of the world understands their responsibility for helping to address this humanitarian crisis?
I'm eager to hear from my colleagues on this, but I'll say one concrete step that I think the U.S. can take immediately is lifting the suspension on humanitarian assistance in the north. It both would have the material impact of letting dollars flow when the needs are so big and the shortfall in funding is also so big. But I also think it has symbolic value in terms of the U.S. being able to bring other donors to the table. If we are putting every dollar that we have on the table, if we are obligating and getting that money to frontline operators as quickly as possible without those kinds of limitations, we have much more moral authority to pressure other donors to do the same.
Thank you. Ms. Almutawakel.
Thank you. I will go to a different angle because there are many things that can be done, right? In Yemen, until now, there is one resolution that came out of the Security Council in 2015. And since then until now, everything has changed. Even the map of parties to the conflict has changed. So we think that Yemen needs, and the US can push for having a new resolution that enhance accountability, urgent actions regarding that can make the situation less miserable, and to put all parties to the conflict in the table, because now we have a fake table, because parties to the conflict are not only Houthis and the government, it's much more than this. So the narrative of the war is controlled by 2216, and it should be changed. This is one thing.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Chairman Deutsch. I really endorse what my colleagues have said, but I think also that as long as we see the conflict protracting, I think we will see more, we will see the humanitarian situation or the humanitarian needs will arise in the other side as well. It is very important that the United States keeps involved in or maintains involvement and exert pressures, uses its leverage with all parties to the conflict to first implement a nationwide ceasefire, because it is very important that the both parties lay down their guns for public services to be functional again, for people to find their ways and survive on daily basis. And also, in the meantime, it is important that for the international community not to leave Yemenis behind. There is a commitment towards the Yemenis, as we have mentioned from the figures and all these struggles and the multiple crises Yemenis are facing. They should not be left alone, and the international community has a commitment there and should step in and help Yemenis towards this struggle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like, before we finish, I want to just spend a moment talking about the impact of the Houthis' ongoing offensive in Marib and the implications for humanitarian access and human rights. And if you could speak to the immediate, if there is an immediate security solution for Marib that can help protect humanitarian interests that all of you are committed to, I would love you to share that with us. If there is. If there's not, I'll go on. Please, Ms. Almutawakel.
Ceasefire, not more and not less. It should be their ceasefire. I know it's complicated and it's complicating everything. There should be a ceasefire.
And finally, there have been reports of multiple reports of child soldiers being used in the conflict. I guess, Ms. Almutawakel, I'll ask you this. If you could speak to the current status of child soldier recruitment in Yemen, the use of migrant children, and I'm going to end with this because I think after what has been a really powerful hearing, speaking about the security situation and access to humanitarian aid and famine and all of the vast needs, there is perhaps nothing that ought to cause more outrage in the near term than the use of children as soldiers, and the reports of, in particular, the reports of children being used as suicide bombers. Can you speak to what's happening and what more the United States can do to prevent this practice specifically?
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning this. It's one of the very horrible violations that is practiced by all parties to the conflict. Yes, they do recruiting children, and we have documented in Mwatana, many cases through the years about recruiting children from all parties to the conflict, but most of them, they were recruited by Houthis. In many cases, those children, they have been taken to the battle and then they came back in 1 week like dead bodies. They're not even trained, and they are pushed in the front lines. And this is linked also with the fact that the educational system in Yemen has collapsed, and this is very sad because it is undermining our future also. And many children, the Yemenis, they like to go to school, and they started to go to school, and then this war just came to mix everything, and to the gains that we had in the previous years has been, vanished because of this war regarding, education in general. So the children, many of them are not going to school now, and many of them are going to the front lines now. I don't know what can be done in this, also except pressure on all parties to the conflict not to recruit children. This is very important. We have done a lot of work in this, but still, I don't know what else than pressure, because parties to the conflict, they don't care, they really don't. So it's only pressure that can work with them, and should be one of the priorities that children should. And it happened also, we have documented increase in the cases of child recruitment with the escalation by Houthis toward Marib. And there were children who have been recruited and then came back in 1 week like dead bodies. And this battle that will be end for nothing. And children, including children until 15, children like 9, 10, 11. Pressure? I don't know what more.
As we continue to press for a ceasefire, as we work to ensure that humanitarian needs are met, I think the image of children being used as soldiers ought to compel all of us to work even harder to address the tragic situation. Ms. Almutawakel, Mr. Mohammed, Ms. Catanzano, there are so many issues that we have to grapple with here, and it is my and this committee's intention to make sure that what's happening to the people of Yemen never fall far from the top of the list. It's critical that we continue to highlight what's happening, and to be able to do it by being joined by people on the ground really contributes a lot to the work that we do in helping to elevate this issue. So I'm really grateful to all three of you. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to the members who have joined us for, I think, a very productive and important hearing. And with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.